Hello and welcome to this lesson on the space race. So to give some brief context, the space race occurred in the midst of the Cold War during the 1950s. And the Cold War was essentially a huge conflict between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. And while there was never officially a war declared by either side, the conflict really stemmed from the fear that the other side could launch an attack on them, and that would essentially cause so much destruction and wreak havoc that the nation would essentially suffer long term from a war like this. And so there was basically a conflict from each side that the other side could attack very heavily. Now, the space race officially started in 1957, which is when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and this was the first artificial satellite in Earth's orbit. And while this was in the grand scheme of things, it was not a huge undertaking. However, it still caused panic among Americans because, as we now know, this was occurring during the Cold War, and so America feared that this indicated that they were falling behind in technology, and so they actually launched their own Explorer 1, which, similar to Sputnik, was a satellite that orbited Earth. And additionally, President Eisenhower created NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Association, which basically helped organize and conduct these space exploration missions. And as I mentioned before, the launch of Sputnik panicked Americans, not only because the fear of falling behind in terms of technology, but also the fear that the Soviets could launch a nuclear attack from space. And so that's another reason why this was so important for America. And so a huge step towards space exploration occurred in 1961 when the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was the first man ever to leave Earth and orbit Earth on a spacecraft. And obviously this was a huge event because it was the first person to actually leave Earth. And so in response, later on in that year, Alan Shepard was the first American in space, and additionally, President John F. Kennedy, he promised that by 1970, or by the end of the decade, America would be able to land a man on the moon. And so this was a huge promise, and it was also, again, something that seemed, very difficult to do because, just a few years ago, they started with only a satellite leaving Earth. And so this is really like the foundational steps of space exploration. Finally, the space race ended during the 60s after the success of NASA's Apollo missions. And these missions were designed to, complete John F. Kennedy's vision to land a man on moon by 1970, and eventually they were successful. Along the way, there were, unfortunate events, such as in 1967, when a spacecraft was doing a launch simulation, and it erupted during the launch, killing 3 passengers. However, in 1968, Apollo 8 was launched, and then in 1969, the first 3 astronauts, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins, landed on Moon. And that was essentially the conclusion of the space race. Now, while that was the conclusion, there were still, many important effects that it had to this day. And the most obvious one is the founding of NASA was critical, and all the space exploration missions that they went on, has an impact today because now NASA remains in existence and is now focused on the exploration of Mars. And then furthermore, another side effect was a greater emphasis on STEM education. So during the 1960s, after John F. Kennedy made the promise, there was actually a huge emphasis for schools to start teaching more about science and technology and engineering. And in response, students became more interested in that, and as a result, more students became scientists and engineers. And yeah, those were like the main effects of the space race. So that'll be it for this episode. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.